She stood 12 feet away, champagne glass in hand, pearl earrings on, 800 people watching, and her husband kissed another woman on the main stage like his wife was simply part of the furniture. The room went silent. Phones went up. Someone near the bar actually gasped, but Eleanor Hartwell did not cry, did not scream, did not move a single inch. She just smiled. Small,
Eleanor,
quiet.
please, you have to believe me.
The kind of smile that should have terrified him
and
if he had been paying the
nothing compared
slightest
to you.
attention for the last
Just give me another
15
chance.
years. Because here is what Carter Hartwell did not know as he stood on that stage taking credit for an empire he believed he had built. His wife had spent 3 years building the legal architecture of his destruction. Every contract he signed without reading, every document he initialed without checking, every morning he walked out the door too confident to look back. She had been building. And tonight, the moment Carter thought was his greatest triumph was actually the signal Eleanor had been waiting for. In the next 100 minutes, you are going to watch a woman who was written out of her own story rewrite the ending, and you are going to learn exactly how she did it. Stay with me. Lesson statement. Here is what this story is really about. The most dangerous thing in the world is not someone who fights loudly. It is someone who prepares quietly. Eleanor did not win because she was lucky. She won because she documented everything, protected what was hers, and refused to let love be a reason to stop paying attention. Whatever you are building right now, in your relationship, in your career, in your life, your name belongs on the paperwork. Your voice belongs in the room. And your patience, when it has a plan behind it, is more powerful than anything someone else can take from you. If this story is already speaking to you, do one thing before you go any further. Hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells me this kind of story matters to you. Drop a comment with your city, just your city. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels today. And if you know someone who is in the middle of their own quiet battle right now, someone who is tired, someone who has been patient for too long and needs to hear that the ending can still be rewritten, share this with them. You might not know that you are sharing it at exactly the right moment, but you might be. Subscribe if you want to see what gets built next. Because stories like Eleanor's do not end here. They are just getting started.
The Hartwell Foundation Gala was the kind of event that made Charleston feel like the center of the universe. 800 guests, crystal chandeliers throwing warm gold across the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. Champagne that cost more than most people's car payments. The kind of crowd where fortunes changed hands over handshakes and reputations were built or broken over dinner. Eleanor Hartwell stood near the east wall in a navy gown, holding a champagne glass she had not touched in 40 minutes. She wore the pearl earrings Carter had given her on their 10th anniversary. Small, classic, the kind of jewelry a man gives a woman he thinks of as tasteful and undemanding. She was watching the room the way she always watched rooms, quietly, precisely, the way you watch something you know is about to change forever. Her best friend Claire Sutton materialized at her elbow, plucking a fresh glass from a passing waiter's tray. "Your husband is about to give his speech," Claire said. "Try to look proud, and not like you're calculating something." "I always look proud," Eleanor said. "You look like someone solving a geometry problem. Those are not mutually exclusive." Up on the main stage, Carter Hartwell approached the podium to accept the Charleston Business Council's Philanthropist of the Year award. He looked exactly as he always looked at events like this: tall, confident, the kind of man who wore power like a second skin and never once questioned whether it fit. Eleanor had written his acceptance speech. She always wrote his speeches. He spoke for 4 minutes about vision and community and the responsibility of success. He used 3 phrases she had drafted the previous night at 11 o'clock while he slept. The crowd applauded warmly, and then Carter Hartwell did something that was not in the speech. He turned toward Diana Cross, his VP of Strategic Development, who stood just off the stage in a red dress that had been chosen to be noticed. He extended his hand. She stepped forward. And he pulled her into a kiss that lasted 1 second, 2, 3, 4. Not a polite kiss, not a professional kiss, The kind of kiss between two people who have been kissing for a long time and have simply stopped caring who watches. 800 people went completely silent. Phones rose across the ballroom like a slow wave. Cameras flashed. Someone near the bar made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. Eleanor stood 12 feet away. She did not move, did not flinch, did not make a sound. She watched her husband kiss another woman in front of everyone who mattered in Charleston and felt something settle in her chest that was not grief and not rage, but something colder and more final than either. Claire grabbed her arm with both hands. Ellie. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. Ellie, your husband just... I know, Eleanor said. In front of everyone, I know. Should we leave? Do you need air? Do you want me to say something to him right now? Because I will absolutely say something right now. I have been waiting years to say something. No. Eleanor finally took a sip of her champagne. No scene? Then what are we doing? Eleanor set her glass down on the nearest table. She looked at Carter on the stage, already moving on, already shaking the governor's hand, already performing the easy confidence of a man who had never once faced a real consequence. She smiled, small, private, the particular smile of someone who has just watched their opponent make the move they spent 3 years waiting for. We are letting him think he got away with it, she said. Claire stared at her. How long have you been planning something? 3 years. 3. Claire caught herself, lowered her voice with visible effort. 3 years? You have been sitting on something for 3 years and you did not tell me? I am telling you now. I need another drink. You just got that one. Eleanor, I need another drink. Eleanor almost smiled again. Come on, she said. We are leaving. They walked out through the frozen crowd, past the phones and the whispers and the 800 people who would be talking about this moment for months. Eleanor moved at a steady, unhurried pace. No rushing, no drama. The silver of her gown caught the chandelier light as she passed through the main doors. Behind her, the ballroom erupted into noise. She did not look back. Outside, the Charleston night was warm and thick with the smell of jasmine and distant rain. Eleanor stood at the top of the hotel steps and breathed in the darkness and felt the stillness of a plan finally in motion. She pulled out her phone, typed a single message to James Calloway. 3 words. Execute Phase 1. She put the phone away. Okay, Claire said, appearing beside her and wrapping both arms around herself despite the warmth. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. Eleanor looked out at the city she had lived in for 15 years. The city where her name appeared in paragraph 7. The city where 800 people had just watched her husband publicly choose someone else and assumed Eleanor Hartwell would simply adjust. They did not know Eleanor Hartwell. Not really. Let us get in the car, she said. This is going to take a while. Eleanor Sterling had graduated top of her class from the University of Virginia School of Law at 26 years old. At 28, she made junior partner at Harrison and Webb, one of Charleston's most respected corporate law firms. Youngest junior partner in the firm's history. First woman to reach the position before 30. She was building something extraordinary. She knew it. The partners knew it. Everyone in the building knew it. Then she met Carter at a conference on coastal development financing. He was 31. He ran a small real estate startup on borrowed money and genuine vision. He was charming in the particular way of people who are absolutely certain they are going somewhere. He made every room feel charged with possibility. Eleanor fell in love with his ambition before she fell in love with him. They married 18 months after meeting. She told herself she would keep working. Junior partners kept working. She had fought too hard to stop now, but Carter's company needed legal structure, needed contracts and frameworks and someone who understood both finance and law. Eleanor understood both better than anyone he could hire. She took a leave of absence. Temporary, she told herself. 6 months, maybe a year. She invested her inheritance, $4.2 million, from her grandmother's estate, accumulated over 60 years of careful, patient building by a woman who had understood exactly what money meant when you had it and what it meant when someone else controlled it. Seed capital, Eleanor called it, an investment in their future. She spent the first year building the legal foundation of what would become the Hartwell Group. She drafted the partnership agreements, she structured the initial contracts, she wrote the framework that allowed Carter's vision to become a functioning company with longevity and protection built into every document. Carter provided the handshake, the energy, the face. Eleanor provided everything underneath. The leave of absence became permanent when their daughter, Emma, arrived. 2 years later, their son, William, completed the picture. The company grew. Carter's name appeared on buildings and in profiles and on awards he accepted at galas, while Eleanor sat in the audience wearing appropriate jewelry. By year 5, she had stopped correcting people who introduced her as Carter's wife without asking her name. By year 8, she had stopped noticing. The moment she remembered later, the moment that had quietly cracked something open, was at a dinner party in year 10. A man she had never met shook her hand and said, "And you must be Carter's wife," and turned away before she could speak. She opened her mouth to say, Eleanor, to say that she had a name and a law degree and had built the legal architecture of a company that employed 47 people, that her grandmother's money had made this man's champagne possible. But the man was already talking to someone else, and Eleanor closed her mouth and understood, quietly and completely, what she had traded. The realization did not make her angry. She was past anger by year 10. What it made her was clear. The particular clarity that comes when you stop telling yourself a story that no longer fits the facts. She began paying attention differently after that. She noticed how Carter introduced Diana Cross at board meetings. "My invaluable strategic partner," he said, "my right hand, the creative force behind our growth strategy." Diana had been at the company for 8 months at that point. She had joined 6 months after Eleanor had quietly restructured the company's legal framework in a way that Carter had not bothered to read. She noticed how Diana looked at Carter, and how Carter looked at Diana. The specific electricity of two people who have decided something about each other. She noticed that Carter came home later, that his phone went face down at dinner, that he mentioned Diana's name with the particular casualness of someone working hard to seem casual. She noticed all of it, and she made a choice, not the choice that most people would have made. Not a confrontation, not an ultimatum, not a tearful demand for honesty. Eleanor Sterling Hartwell made the choice of a corporate attorney who had spent a decade building structures designed to protect assets. She called James Calloway. James had been her closest friend since their first year at Virginia Law. He was the kind of attorney who wore slightly rumpled suits and remembered every detail of every case he had ever touched. He was also the only person in Charleston, outside of Eleanor herself, who understood how completely she had built the Hartwell Group and how little legal protection she currently had for that contribution. "I need you to help me build something," she told him, quietly, carefully, with documentation so thorough that no one can question it. "What kind of something?" James asked. "An exit," Eleanor said. "That is also a foundation." They spent 6 months designing the Whitmore Trust, an irrevocable trust with Eleanor as sole beneficiary and trustee. Legally airtight, documented with the thoroughness of someone who had spent a decade drafting contracts for a living. Then she spent 2 more years quietly, carefully transferring the Hartwell Group's core assets into the trust structure through mechanisms that were entirely legal and entirely invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention to paperwork. Carter signed documents without reading them. He had always signed documents without reading them because he trusted Eleanor to handle the details. That trust, paradoxically, was the most honest thing he had ever given her. By the night of the gala, the Whitmore Trust controlled 61% of the Hartwell Group's core assets. The family home had been transferred to the trust 2 years prior. The children's accounts were protected in a separate structure that no divorce proceeding could touch. Eleanor had not planned for a divorce. She had planned for the truth, and the truth was this. A man who treated his wife like expensive furniture would eventually stop being careful about it, would eventually do something so public and so undeniable that the pretense of a functioning marriage became impossible to maintain even for the person maintaining it. She had simply made sure she was ready when that moment came. Now it had come. In the car on the way home from the gala, Claire sat in the passenger seat in stunned silence for 90 full seconds. Then she said, "You built the whole thing? The entire company? The legal foundation, the capital structure, the early contracts, and he does not know. He knows I was helpful in the beginning," Eleanor said. "That is how he remembers it." And the trust? He signed the restructuring documents 18 months ago during a quarterly contract review, 12 pages. He initialed every page. Did he read them? Eleanor kept her eyes on the road. "No," she said. "He never does." Claire was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "Eleanor Ann Hartwell, you have been the most patient person I have ever known, and I am now understanding that patience in an entirely new context." "It was not patience," Eleanor said. "It was preparation." "What is the difference?" Eleanor turned onto the street where the house stood, the house that was legally, documentably, irrevocably hers. "Patience waits," she said. "Preparation builds." Eleanor arrived home to find Carter already there. He stood in the kitchen in his tuxedo jacket without the tie, pouring scotch with the practiced ease of a man who felt no particular urgency about the evening's events. The kitchen was beautiful, marble countertops, custom cabinetry. Eleanor had overseen every detail of the renovation 4 years ago, while Carter approved the final design and accepted compliments about his taste when Charleston Magazine ran a feature. He looked up when she came in. "You left early?" he said. "I left at the same time you did. You simply did not notice." She set her clutch on the counter, removed her heels, stood in the kitchen in her navy gown and her pearl earrings, and waited. Carter's expression arranged itself into the particular configuration of a man preparing to manage a problem. Calm, practiced, faintly impatient in the way of someone who considers emotional conversations an inefficient use of time. "We should talk about tonight," he said. "Should we?" It was nothing. Diana and I got caught up in the moment. The award, the champagne, the energy of the evening. It will not happen again. Eleanor looked at him. "It will not happen again," she repeated. "Correct." "Carter, there are 47,000 people who watched a video of it in the 6 hours since it happened." He winced, a small controlled wince. "The social media situation will pass. These things always pass. What I need from you," he stopped, recalibrated. "What I would appreciate is if you could handle the narrative on our end. Something for the Foundation's communications team. about the strength of our partnership, our shared commitment. You want me to write a statement defending our marriage. You are better at that kind of thing than I am." Eleanor looked at her husband, the man she had loved at 28 with the unguarded certainty of someone who has not yet learned to love carefully, the man who had given her 2 children she adored and 15 years of being slowly, completely, entirely erased. "You kissed another woman on stage in front of 800 people," she said, "and your response is to ask me to manage the public relation. I am asking you to be a partner." "A partner," Eleanor said softly. "That is an interesting word." She said goodnight and walked upstairs. She heard Carter pour a second scotch. She did not go back down. She sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning after Carter fell asleep. The house was the kind of quiet that makes you hear everything you have been successfully not hearing for years. Eleanor did not cry. She had finished crying about Carter Hartwell somewhere around year 11, but she allowed herself, in the dark and the stillness, to feel the full accumulated weight of what 15 years had cost her. Not just tonight. Tonight was almost beside the point. She thought about the conference in Denver, where he had introduced Diana as his invaluable partner and introduced Eleanor, when he remembered, as my wife. She thought about Emma's school play last spring, the one Carter promised to attend and instead sent his assistant with a card. She thought about the Harrison and Webb partnership she had been on track for, about the woman she had been before she made herself into a supporting role in someone else's story. She thought about all the contracts bearing Carter's signature that she had drafted, all the strategies carrying Carter's name that she had built, all the speeches delivered with Carter's confidence that had started as words she typed at 11 o'clock while he slept. She opened her laptop, typed a message to James Calloway, confirming what she had already sent from outside the gala. Then she closed the laptop and looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she had changed, but because she had been looking away from herself for so long that seeing clearly felt foreign. Here is something worth knowing, and Eleanor would tell you this herself if she were sitting across from you right now. There is a moment in many long relationships where you look in the mirror and cannot find yourself, where the version of you that existed before feels like a photograph of someone else, where you have made so many small adjustments, so many quiet accommodations, given away so many pieces of who you were that the original is hard to locate. That moment is not the end. That moment is a door. The question is whether you walk through it or keep looking away. Eleanor opened the door. She went upstairs, slept on her side of the bed with 4 inches of distance between herself and Carter that felt like a continent. In the morning, she began the rest of her life. James met her Monday at his downtown office. Coffee, door closed, the quiet efficiency of 2 people who have known each other long enough to skip the parts that are not necessary. "The Whitmore Trust transfer is clean," James said. "All documentation is in order. The asset restructuring completed 6 weeks ago, well before any divorce proceedings could be initiated. Legally, it is airtight." Walk me through it again. "The trust was established 3 years ago with you as sole beneficiary and trustee. It holds 61% of the Hartwell Group's core assets, including the primary real estate portfolio and the operating capital reserves. Carter is listed as CEO and president of the operating company. The operating company answers to the trust. The trust answers to you." He never reviewed the structure, not once in 3 years. He signed the restructuring documents during the quarterly contract review, 12 pages, initialed every page. "The house, transferred to the trust 2 years ago, purchased with your inheritance capital. The transfer is documented, clean, and defensible in any jurisdiction. File the divorce petition Friday, Eleanor said. Give him the weekend to understand what he is looking at. James nodded. Then he looked at her with the directness of someone who has known you long enough to ask the real question. How are you, Ellie? Not the plan, you. Eleanor considered the question honestly. I feel like I can see clearly for the first time in years, she said, which is strange because what I am seeing is difficult. That is what clarity feels like sometimes, James said. I know. She picked up her coffee. Let us get to work. The weekend after the gala felt like a held breath. Eleanor moved her immediate essentials to the furnished apartment she had quietly leased 3 months prior, a 2-bedroom on the south side of downtown. Nothing like the house, clean, functional, and entirely hers. She told Emma and William that she and their father were working through some things, that they would both always be their parents, that nothing important had changed. Emma, who was 14 and perceptive in the specific way of children who have been paying attention to adult subtext for years, said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I am going to be," Eleanor told her, which was the truest answer she had. William, who was 11 and primarily concerned with whether the pizza place near the new apartment delivered, asked if he could bring his gaming equipment. "You can bring whatever you need," Eleanor said. "Can I bring the big monitor?" "Yes." "Can I bring the chair?" "William, just asking." That evening, Claire arrived at the apartment with wine, a box of good cheese crackers, and the energy of someone who had been waiting years to have this conversation. She sat on the couch, tucked her feet underneath herself, and said, "Okay, explain the whole thing, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." Eleanor spent 30 minutes explaining the trust structure, the asset transfers, the legal timeline. Claire listened without interrupting, which required visible effort. When Eleanor finished, Claire was quiet for 10 seconds. "So you own the company," she said. "The trust does. That you control. Correct. And he signed it over because he has not read a document I put in front of him in 15 years. Claire set down her wine glass, picked it back up, set it down again. "You have been playing 4-dimensional chess," she said, while that man was playing a game on his phone. The metaphor is approximately accurate. For 3 years. The planning started earlier, technically. I do not care about technically right now, Eleanor. I care about the fact that you sat across from that man at dinner every night and you knew. Claire pointed both fingers at her. You knew, and you smiled, and you wrote his speeches, and the whole time you were building the structure, Eleanor said. Building the structure. Claire raised her glass. I want to make a toast. We are not there yet. There are still steps. Then a preliminary toast. To the most patient, most prepared, most quietly devastating woman I have ever known in my life. They clinked glasses. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. The specific lightness of finally being seen by someone who knew what you had been carrying. She was not safe yet. She did not know that. Sunday morning, 8:47, Eleanor was on her second coffee, reviewing documents at the kitchen table, when James called. She knew from the first word, "Ellie?" Just her name. Faith and careful. "Tell me," she said. "Diana Cross filed a formal complaint with the South Carolina Financial Regulatory Board 3 weeks ago, before the gala, before you initiated Phase 1. Eleanor set down her cup. "What kind of complaint?" "Fabricated documentation alleging that you have been moving Hartwell Group assets without proper authorization, mismanagement of corporate funds, potentially fraudulent transfer." The silence stretched. "She filed it 3 weeks ago," Eleanor said. "Yes." "Before I initiated anything?" "Yes." "Which means your transfer looks like a response to the threat instead of a pre-planned legal restructuring." even though the transfer completed 6 weeks before she filed. Dates can be questioned. Perception is currently a problem. There is more, Eleanor said. It was not a question. Diana presented a separate restructuring proposal to Robert Bancroft 8 weeks ago. If current leadership were found to be acting improperly, she positioned herself as the logical replacement CEO candidate. Eleanor stood, walked to the window. She wants the company, she said. She has wanted it since she walked in the door. Carter was the vehicle, not the destination. She is not in love with him. She is in love with the asset he controls, or thought he controlled. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at the city she had built a company in, and understood, with a coldness that was almost admiring, that Diana Cross had been running a parallel play, had anticipated Eleanor's move, had filed preemptively to reframe legal protection as criminal panic. She is better than I expected, Eleanor said. She made one mistake. What? She fabricated documents. Fabricated documents leave a specific kind of evidence when you know where to look. Find it, Eleanor said. Already started. But Ellie... James paused. This is going to get worse before it gets better. He was right. It got worse in 3 consecutive waves. The first wave hit Tuesday morning. The regulatory complaint went public. Eleanor did not know yet how it leaked. Later, she would learn that Diana had a contact at a local business outlet who had been holding the story, waiting for the signal. The headline read, Hartwell Group co-founder under investigation for financial misconduct. Co-founder. Diana had planted that word carefully. It made Eleanor sound like an insider attempting to steal from the inside. It reframed legal protection as criminal behavior. By noon, 2 regional outlets and 1 national business wire had picked it up. Eleanor's phone rang 31 times before she turned it off. A woman she had served alongside on a non-profit board for 6 years sent a text saying she thought it best to create some distance until things became clearer. Former colleagues became unavailable. 15 years of reputation, carefully constructed, began to shift under her feet in real time. Eleanor sat in her apartment that evening and did not panic. Panic was not available to her. She had spent too many years building things carefully to allow the threat of their unraveling to cost her the precision she needed right now. She made a list of every person who mattered and what they needed to hear and how to ensure they heard it in the right sequence. Then she sent 2 emails, called James, and went to bed. The second wave hit Wednesday morning at 7. James called before her coffee finished brewing. Carter's attorneys had filed for emergency injunctive relief to freeze all Whitmore Trust assets pending the regulatory investigation. The argument was clean and procedurally appropriate. If assets were under investigation, they should be frozen until the investigation concluded. A judge granted the temporary freeze by 11. Eleanor's legal structure, 3 years of careful construction, was locked in a courtroom box. She could not touch it, could not move it, could not deploy it. Everything she had built to protect herself was now being used as evidence against her. She called James. How long for the freeze to be challenged, she asked. 2 weeks minimum for an emergency hearing, more likely 3 to 4 for a substantive challenge. And in that time, Carter's attorneys will use the perception of the investigation to challenge the original transfer documentation. They will argue that the transfer was premeditated fraud. Yes. It was premeditated, Eleanor said. It was not fraud. There is a significant legal distinction. I know that. You know that. The hearing is where we will prove it. 3 weeks, Eleanor said. I am moving as fast as I legally can. I know you are. She paused. Keep going. The third wave hit Thursday afternoon and was the cruelest of the three because it was not legal. It was personal. A moderately followed Charleston social media account posted a thread titled, "The Real Story Behind the Hartwell Divorce." The thread contained private text messages, selectively edited, out of context, but in their framing, devastating. The messages had been taken from Carter's phone. Eleanor recognized them. They were from a period 2 years ago when she had been working through whether to initiate the legal separation, when her doubts and her hurt had expressed themselves in late-night messages that she had sent believing they were private. In their original context, they were the messages of a woman in pain working through a difficult decision. In Diana's framing, they looked like obsession, paranoia, instability. An unnamed source described Eleanor as erratic and difficult to reason with. By Friday morning, the thread had been shared 4,000 times. The story being told about Eleanor Hartwell was unrecognizable. She was no longer the wronged wife. She was the dangerous one, the woman who had tried to commit fraud because she could not handle her husband moving on. Eleanor sat in James's office Friday afternoon while he delivered all 3 updates in sequence. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, she reframed everything. She turned your preparation into premeditation, your composure into guilt, your privacy into concealment. The text messages. Carter gave her access. Almost certainly. He gave her everything, Eleanor said quietly, not with anger, with the flat exhaustion of being proven right about something she had hoped to be wrong about. She looked at James across the conference table. Tell me again about the fabricated documents. Our forensic accountant has found 3 inconsistencies. The metadata on 2 of Diana's submitted documents shows creation dates that post-date the transactions they claim to document. The timestamps were altered. That is evidence of fraud, Eleanor said. Her fraud. Yes. How long to build the case into something usable? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Eleanor nodded. Then that is how long this takes, she said. Here's what Eleanor understood in that moment that is worth understanding for anyone who has ever been in a situation where the truth exists but has not yet been proved. When someone attacks your reputation, your first instinct is to respond immediately, loudly, to correct every lie and address every accusation and make sure everyone understands the truth right now. Do not. Loud defense looks like panic. Quiet evidence looks like confidence. Eleanor wanted to respond to every single thing Diana had put in motion. She wanted to call the journalist and the board members and the regulatory investigators and explain clearly and precisely what had actually happened. Instead, she let James build the case. She let the paper trail speak. Because the person who speaks first in a dispute rarely wins. The person who speaks last, with documentation, almost always does. She went home, she called her children, she ate dinner, she slept, she waited. James Calloway spent 17 days taking Diana's fabrication apart. The forensic accounting report was 63 pages, precise, methodical. It documented 3 separate instances of timestamp manipulation and 2 cases of altered transaction records, with a specificity that made the fraud not just visible, but undeniable. He submitted the report to the South Carolina Financial Regulatory Board on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, the investigation into Eleanor had been formally closed. The board issued a brief public statement confirming that all allegations had been found to be without foundation and that the complaint itself appeared to contain deliberately falsified documentation. Patricia Wells, the lead investigator, called Eleanor directly. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, I want to apologize for the disruption this caused. You were doing your job, Eleanor said. The person who should apologize is someone else entirely. Agreed, Patricia said, and left it there. The second domino fell 48 hours later inside the Hartwell Group's main conference room on the 6th floor of the downtown tower. Carter, presented simultaneously with the forensic evidence of Diana's fabrication and with the information that she had been in active discussions with Robert Bancroft about replacing him as CEO, experienced what could be charitably described as a significant professional moment. Claire received real-time updates from a friend who worked on the floor below. The texts arrived over 19 minutes. Something is happening in the big conference room. Carter is not using his indoor voice. Diana just told him she never actually believed in his vision. He threw a legal pad at the wall. He is firing her. Officially. There are 4 witnesses. She called him a temporary inconvenience on her way out. She said it in the hallway, loudly. The receptionist is pretending to be extremely interested in her computer screen. Claire read every message aloud to Eleanor, who sat across from her at the apartment kitchen table with coffee and the expression of someone watching weather she had predicted come in exactly as forecast. She allowed herself 4 seconds of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Then she refocused. Carter called her that evening at 7:30. His voice was different. The practiced confidence had been removed, and what remained underneath was rawer and more human than she had heard from him in years. I was wrong, he said. About all of it. About Diana, about what she was doing, about what I allowed to happen. A pause. About us. Eleanor said nothing. I know I do not have the right to ask for anything. I know that. But I am asking anyway because I genuinely do not know how else to do this. His voice dropped. Can we talk? Not through attorneys, just us. Eleanor looked out the window of her apartment. 15 years. Emma and William. The man she had loved when she was 28 with the clean, uncomplicated love of someone who did not yet know how much love could cost you if you were not careful. Dinner? She said. Neutral location, Thursday. Thursday, Carter said immediately. I will be there. She hung up. Claire looked at her from across the room, where she had been sitting extremely still and obviously listening. Are you? No, Eleanor said. I am hearing him out. There is a difference. Does he know there is a difference? Eleanor considered that. No, she said. He does not. She should have remembered that Carter Hartwell had always been very good at hearing what he wanted to hear. Thursday dinner. A quiet restaurant on the south side of downtown. The kind of place where difficult conversations could happen without becoming events. Carter arrived first. He was already seated when Eleanor walked in, and she noticed he had ordered water. No scotch. A deliberate signal. An effort. She sat across from him. For the first 20 minutes, it was better than she had expected. He talked about Emma and William, about how he had been thinking about the accumulated small absences. The school plays and the anniversary dinners and the conferences where he had stood next to Diana and somehow forgotten to stand next to Eleanor. He was not performing, or if he was performing vulnerability convincingly enough that the distinction was hard to locate. Eleanor found herself, against the better judgment of everything she knew, leaning slightly forward. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and turned it face down. The specific quickness of someone who does not want to be asked about what they just saw. Eleanor knew every version of Carter Hartwell's face. She had spent 15 years watching him across the rooms, across tables, across the distance of a bed they shared without touching. She knew what that quickness meant. Who is that? She asked. Work. The phone buzzed again. Carter. He picked it up, typed something brief, set it down with practiced casualness. Sorry. Where were we? We were going to talk about who you were texting. It is nothing important. Eleanor reached across the table and turned the phone face up before he could stop her. The name on the screen was Diana Cross. Not an angry message, not professional. The tone was warm. The tone of two people who had not stopped being what they were to each other. He had not ended it. He was sitting across from his wife at a reconciliation dinner, talking about regret and realizations. And he had not ended the affair. He was running parallel tracks because he could not imagine a version of his future where he did not win everything simultaneously. Eleanor set the phone back down, folded her napkin, picked up her purse. Ellie, do you know what you told me at the gala 3 years ago? Her voice was completely steady. You said, my best quality was my patience. You said it like it was a compliment, like patience was the most useful thing I had to offer. Carter said nothing. I have been patient for 15 years. Through the introductions where I was your wife and not your name. Through the speeches you gave with my words. Through the company you built with my money. Through the birthdays you missed and the dinners where I sat next to you and you looked past me at someone more interesting. She stood. I am done being patient. Please. Can we just... No, Eleanor said, simply, without heat. We cannot. She walked out. She did not look back. She did not need to. There is a difference between patience and tolerance. It is one of the more important differences to understand. Patience is strategic. It is the choice to wait because the timing is not yet right, because you are building toward something, because waiting serves a deliberate purpose. Tolerance is different. Tolerance is accepting treatment you know is wrong and calling it love. Telling yourself that if you are just patient enough, kind enough, invisible enough, the person you love will eventually become who you need them to be. Eleanor had spent 15 years tolerating and calling it patience. The moment she stood up from that dinner table was the moment she finally understood the difference. If you are waiting for someone to choose you, not eventually, not someday, but right now, tonight, pay attention to how long you have been waiting. At some point, waiting stops being patience and becomes something you owe yourself the honesty to name correctly. Carter hired Harrison Webb III. In Charleston legal circles, the man had been called the Shredder for 20 years. He specialized in high-asset divorce cases and was known for a single primary approach: make the proceedings so painful and so expensive and so damaging to all parties that the opposing side settled for less than they deserved just to make it stop. He was very good at his job. He filed 17 motions in the first week. The central argument was creative and not without legal merit. Assets acquired during the marriage using Eleanor's premarital inheritance, actively managed by both parties across 15 years, could under certain interpretations of South Carolina law constitute marital property. The Whitmore trust transfer, he argued, had been executed with fraudulent intent to deprive Carter of his legitimate marital interest. James reviewed the filings and met with Eleanor the following morning. We will win, he said. The pre-marital asset protection is solid and the trust documentation is thorough, but winning will take 8 to 10 months. Legal fees to fight this properly will be between $200,000 and $250,000. Eleanor nodded. And the alternative? Settlement. You accept somewhat less than the full trust value for a clean, fast resolution. How much less? James named a number. Not devastating, not acceptable. There is one more thing, James said. He set down his pen. Eleanor had known James long enough to understand what that gesture meant. Harrison Webb has indicated he is prepared to depose Emma and William. The room went completely still. They are 14 and 11, Eleanor said. I know. What could they contribute to a financial dispute about asset structures that were established before either of them was born? Nothing meaningful, but the depositions would expose them to the full specifics of the affair, the investigation, the legal history, and regardless of whether a judge ultimately allows them, the threat creates pressure. Eleanor sat with that. Her daughter, who had stopped eating lunch at school for 2 weeks after the separation was announced. Her son, who had started sleeping with the light on, again for the first time since he was 7. She had protected the assets. She had protected the legal structure. She had been so careful, so thorough, so precise about every document and timeline and filing. She had not fully accounted for Carter's willingness to use their children as leverage. For the first time in the entire process, Eleanor felt something close to genuine fear, not of losing the money, not of losing the case, afraid of what winning completely on principle might cost the two people she loved without calculation or condition. She pressed her hands flat on James's conference table. What options do I have that protect Emma and William from being in a courtroom? She said. Faster resolution, which means either settlement or... James paused. Or we change the pressure equation entirely. How? We need to change what Carter stands to lose if he continues. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Robert Bancroft. James looked at her. I have never told you everything, Eleanor said. About how far ahead I planned. Tell me now, James said. She told him about the silent stake in Bancroft Capital, 12% acquired 31 months ago through a holding company with no name connection to Hartwell or Sterling. Held quietly, never mentioned. Waiting. James was silent for several seconds. You own a stake in the company that funds the Hartwell Group, he said. 12%. You have never exercised it. Not once. Ellie, James said slowly, you have been holding that card for nearly 3 years. I was waiting for the right moment, she said. Is this the right moment? Eleanor thought about Emma not eating lunch, about William sleeping with the light on. Yes, she said, make the call. Eleanor called Robert Bancroft on a Tuesday morning. First contact they had ever had. Mr. Bancroft, she said, my name is Eleanor Hartwell. I believe we have some shared interests we have never discussed. There was a pause. Mrs. Hartwell, Bancroft said, I have been wondering when you would call. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor was direct and specific. She laid out the complete situation. Diana's fabricated complaint, the corporate espionage, Carter's use of investor pressure as a divorce litigation strategy, the forensic evidence of Diana's fraud, the regulatory board's findings. She also noted, without emphasis but without omission, that as a 12% stakeholder in Bancroft Capital, she had a legitimate interest in how the firm's capital was being deployed in situations generating significant legal and reputational exposure. Bancroft listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. I owe you an apology, he said. Diana's presentation was convincing, and I acted without verifying. That was a mistake I do not intend to repeat. What would you like to do going forward? Eleanor said. I would like to withdraw my support for Carter's current legal strategy, Bancroft said. And I would like to communicate to Harrison Webb that continued aggressive litigation is not in the interest of Bancroft Capital's portfolio companies. I appreciate that, Eleanor said. One more thing, Bancroft said. Whatever you are building next, I would like to hear about it. I will be in touch, Eleanor said. The second revelation came from James, who had been running a parallel track on Diana's activities since her termination from the Hartwell Group. On her last day in the office, Diana had copied 37 proprietary files to a personal drive, project proposals, client lists, strategic development plans. some of them originated by Eleanor, all of them confidential property of the Hartwell Group. Corporate espionage, documented with timestamps, access logs, and the server transfer record. Eleanor had the evidence to pursue criminal charges and civil damages that would follow Diana Cross for years. She chose not to. Claire, upon hearing this, looked at her with the expression of someone in genuine conflict. You are not going to destroy her. I am going to make her irrelevant, Eleanor said, which is more effective and takes considerably less of my time. She offered Diana a choice through James. Sign a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-compete covering all Hartwell Group operations for 5 years with significant financial penalties for any violation, or face criminal prosecution. Diana's attorney called back within 18 hours. She would sign. You know what is terrifying about you, Claire said afterward. You are scarier when you are being reasonable than when you are being aggressive. I know, Eleanor said. That is the point. The third revelation came from Margaret Hartwell. Carter's mother called on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 71 years old, and she had spent 42 years in a marriage to a man who had taken credit for things she quietly made possible. She recognized the pattern in her son with the particular clarity of someone who had lived it firsthand. Eleanor, she said, I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. Go ahead, Margaret. I have known about the Whitmore Trust for 2 years. Silence. I found out accidentally. Something Carter said about the legal structure that did not add up. I had my own attorney look into it quietly. You never told him, Eleanor said. No, and I want you to know why. Margaret paused. Because you earned it. You built that company. You protected your assets the way any sensible person who loved a man like my son should have done, and what I never did for myself. Her voice was steady. Carter called me this morning asking if I knew anything. I told him to figure it out himself, and I told him he should have paid attention. You protected me, Eleanor said. I protected the truth. There is a difference. But I am glad you protected yourself. They were quiet together for a moment, two women who had made themselves useful to the same man in different ways, one of whom had found the door out. After the call ended, Claire appeared in the doorway, having caught the muffled shape of the conversation. What just happened? Carter's mother has known for 2 years. Claire stared. Margaret? Pearls at breakfast. Margaret? Yes. A long pause. Margaret, Claire said, with an emphasis that needed no elaboration. Without Bancroft's backing, the shredder's leverage collapsed. Carter's litigation strategy lost its structural support within days. Harrison Webb delivered the assessment to his client plainly. Settle, he said. You are holding a losing hand, and the cost of playing it is going to be enormous. The settlement took 3 weeks to finalize. Eleanor received full control of the Whitmore Trust and all assets within it. The family home transferred to her name. Appropriate child support was established. Primary custody went to Eleanor, with Carter having generous scheduled time with Emma and William. Because Eleanor was not interested in punishing her children for their father's failures, Carter retained his title at the Hartwell Group's operating company. His name stayed on the door. He answered to a reconstituted board that included Eleanor as a non-executive director with veto power over major strategic decisions. He had built his reputation on her foundation. She let him keep the reputation. She kept the foundation. The morning after the settlement was signed, Eleanor sat in James's office with coffee and the particular quiet that follows the end of something long and costly. It is done, James said. It is done, Eleanor agreed. They sat with that for a moment. For what it is worth, James said, you are the most precise client I have ever worked with, and I have worked with a lot of precise people. My grandmother used to say that the difference between a plan and a wish is documentation, Eleanor said. Your grandmother was right. Eleanor picked up her coffee. What is on my calendar for this afternoon? James smiled. Foundation board meeting at 2. Mentorship program call at 4. Dinner with Emma and William at their favorite restaurant. That is everything, Eleanor said. That is everything, he agreed. 6 months after the settlement, the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation occupied a bright office suite on the 4th floor of a building Eleanor owned through the Whitmore Trust. The work was focused and practical, targeted at women re-entering the workforce after career gaps. The specific kind of gap that happened when you set your own ambitions aside to support someone else's. The specific kind of gap Eleanor knew from the inside with the precision of personal experience. Sarah Gallagher knocked on the open office door one Tuesday afternoon. She was direct, efficient, and completely unimpressed by reputation or history, which Eleanor considered a significant professional virtue. The spring mentorship cohort is full, Sarah said. 212 applicants. We can currently serve 40. Expand the waitlist program, Eleanor said. I want everyone who applies to receive something. The resource guide at minimum. A check-in call. Already drafted the protocol. Sarah paused. The Charleston Business Journal called again about a profile piece. Thank you and no. Also, the Hartwell Group lost the Henderson contract this morning. It is in the Business Wire. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah left. Claire appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds later because Claire had developed an uncanny ability to arrive immediately after interesting information. Henderson, she said. I heard. And you feel? Nothing, Eleanor said, which was true. And which was, she had come to understand, not emptiness, but freedom. The absence of Carter Hartwell from the emotional real estate of her daily life was not a loss. It was space that had been filling up, deliberately and with great care, with things she had chosen. Nothing, Eleanor repeated, and it is genuinely wonderful. Claire sat across from her. I am proud of you. Do not get sentimental. Too late. It is happening. Claire looked at her steadily. You gave up the most promising legal career in the city. You made yourself invisible for 15 years. You survived a fabricated investigation and a public humiliation and an attorney called the Shredder. And now you are sitting in an office you own, running something that actually matters. She tilted her head. Are you happy? Eleanor looked out her window at the Charleston skyline, at the city where she had been invisible for 15 years and had chosen, one careful piece at a time, to make herself visible again. Yes, she said, without qualification, without caveat, yes. That evening, Eleanor picked up Emma and William from school. Emma climbed into the passenger seat with her backpack and her earbuds, and then immediately pulled one earbud out, which meant she had something to say. Mom, yes? You seem different. Different how? Emma thought about it with the seriousness she gave to things she actually wanted to get right. Less like you are waiting for something to go wrong, she said finally. Eleanor looked at her daughter. 14 years old and already understanding something it had taken Eleanor decades to learn. I am not waiting anymore, Eleanor said. Good, Emma said. Put her earbud back in. William climbed into the back with his backpack and a water bottle and the directness of someone who had not yet learned to approach things sideways. Are we getting the good pasta? We are getting the good pasta. Can I get 2 orders of breadsticks? Push it and see what happens. William grinned. Eleanor drove her children to dinner through the streets of the city she had always loved and had finally, fully, reclaimed as her own. Here's what Eleanor Hartwell's story actually teaches. Not just the part about the trust structure and the documentation and the importance of getting your name on the paperwork, though all of that matters enormously and you should absolutely do it. The deeper thing. Eleanor did not win because she was smarter than Carter, though she was. She did not win because she was colder or more calculated. She won because of something simpler and harder and more lasting than any of that. She won because she paid attention to the document, to the slow accumulation of small surrenders before they became irreversible. And most importantly, to herself, to the woman in the dark kitchen window at 2 a.m, who was still there, still whole, still worth fighting for. She won because, when she finally saw clearly, she did not look away again. There is a woman somewhere reading this right now or listening to this right now who is in year 7, or year 9, or year 12 of making herself smaller so that someone else feels bigger, who has been so patient, so accommodating, so quietly excellent in the background that she has started to forget what she looks like in the foreground. This is for her. Your name belongs on the paperwork. Not because love is not real, but because love and legal protection are genuinely different things, and you deserve both. Your voice belongs in the room, not when convenient, not occasionally, always. Your quiet is not weakness, it is patience. And patience, when it has a plan and documentation and a clear-eyed understanding of what it is building toward, is the most powerful thing in the world. Do not wait for someone to recognize your worth. Build the structure that protects it. Document everything. Know what you own, and when the moment comes, and it will come, be ready. Editorial disclaimer: the story you are about to hear was researched, constructed, and carefully edited by our team to deliver meaning, emotional truth, and real-world lessons through the power of dramatic narrative. All characters, names, events, and situations are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is entirely coincidental. This content is intended for mature audiences who appreciate long-form, dramatic storytelling. Our goal is simple: to give you a story worth your time, one that entertains, challenges, and leaves you with something real to carry forward. Now, let us begin.